دكتور مطلق، مساء الخير. من بعد إذنك بس إذا نختبر عند حضرتك الصوت نشوف كيف الأمور.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. مرحبا أخي الكريم.
أوكي ممتاز، يسلم شكرا كثير. طيب شباب، ستارت ريكوردينج من بعد إذنكم. المترجمين بي ريدي بليز.
عفوا لو تكرمت، المداخلة بتكون باللغة العربية ولا بالإنجليزية؟
الإنجليزية. تمام. طيب just one announcement please for the interpretation. Please go for the interpretation icon here in Zoom and choose the language that you want to hear the conference on it. English, it means English. Chinese, it means Dari. Spanish, it means Arabic. Pashto. And for the second announcement, please make sure you are muted during the conference, and when you want to participate, just to take the chance to
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه
In the
أجمعين.
name of God, most gracious, most merciful, I would like to welcome you all. We will start in Arabic.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you happen to join us from. A very warm welcome to you all. My name is Sultan Barakat, and I'm the director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies in Doha. We've been extremely fortunate to be able to join forces with our sister organization, the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, based in Washington, to organize what I think is probably one of the very first academic conferences to tackle the issue of Afghanistan and the transition from conflict to peace since the Afghan talks have started, or the intra-Afghan talks have started almost 2 years ago. The conception of this conference was originally thought as a continuation of an earlier idea that we started that focused on creating a forum that can consider the future options for Afghanistan purely based on Afghan participation. That particular initiative did not really take off well at the start, I think largely because of the timing. And since then, we have been involved in a number of track 2 initiatives supporting the peace process in one way or the other. Some of you have participated in our Heart of Asia Society collaboration on regional politics surrounding the issue of Afghanistan, and others have taken part in various functions that we've hosted or organized on some of the critical issues facing the peace process in Afghanistan. Today, this is an opportunity to bring together the academic community and to try and achieve a number of simultaneous objectives, which I believe are very, very important for Afghanistan moving forward, and more so for the international community that is intending to support Afghanistan in its search for peace. At the one level, we hope that our discussion here will build on the long history of established research on Afghanistan. Afghanistan, and probably since the 9/11 and the intervention by the United States that followed, is, to my mind, one of the best studied and analyzed contexts of conflict. In fact, many of the theories and hypotheses about how we understand conflict and how we respond to it has developed based on experimentation and research in Afghanistan. However, over the last couple of years, and possibly in the rush of making decisions and with the enthusiasm that has hovered over everyone's mind to try and make progress as fast as possible, we were not consistently referring back to that research. So ideas that have already been discussed in the past may have been revisited again, but without serious reflection on the what lessons have been learned over the last 20 years or so. The one important objective of this conference is to try and dig deep into the reservoir of knowledge that has been accumulated in various circles of academic expertise related to Afghanistan. And you can see this from the invited list of participants who come from all continents around the world, of countries and institutions and think tanks who have shown interest in Afghanistan over the years and dedicated time and resources to research the conflict in depth. We also hope that as a result of this conference, and as a result of us being able to invite, and they've kindly agreed to join us, a number of keynote speakers who are at the forefront of the current developments in terms of the peace process, and who would, I'm sure, find it extremely useful to build this bridge between academia and policy. We often speak of the research policy nexus, and I think this is a way of trying to establish that. We've also made a lot of effort to make sure that our discussion is contextualized and localized within the context of the country as much as possible. You will see that from the list of our speakers and the panels that will follow, roughly half, if not more than half, are Afghan scholars that have risen in the last 10, 20 years and have made incredible contribution. And some are on different political point of views. Some may agree more with the Republican view of the discussion. Others have a slightly different point of view. So we have, Sorry, I apologize. I received a message that interrupted us. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Qahtani. Thank you. Uh, Sorry, I'll go back. So the other objective we have tried to achieve from this is to try and localize the knowledge as much as possible and rely and offer the opportunity for as many as possible of our Afghan colleagues, scholars who have been dedicating time and efforts and resources to try and study their own context. And finally, importantly, I think through this conference, build bridges between those Afghan scholars and some of the more established international players that have really dominated the work on Afghanistan for the last 20 years. So please, when you consider, when you think about this conference, do keep in mind that it is designed as independent initiative. It is not linked to any governmental effort. It is not linked to any official track one. It is purely just in the expectation of advancing academia and academic thinking across the board on the conflict in Afghanistan. In doing so, we are extremely grateful for our three keynote speakers, Dr. Al-Qahtani from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Doha, President Ashraf Ghani will also be speaking to us tomorrow, and then Sister Fatima Gailani will speak the day after. We have designed the conference over 3 days in order to cope with the demands of remote conferencing. Ideally, we would have loved to have you all come together in Doha and enjoy our wonderful campus at the Doha Institute and the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, but unfortunately that was not possible. So what we've done is we broke the conference into 3 days. Every day we will be together for about just over 3 hours, 3 to 4 hours, where we have the day starting with a keynote and then 2 panels. Every panel will include 3 to 4 presentations. The papers ultimately will be collated together in one volume, which we hope to publish by the end of the year. We also hope that this is not going to be the last time we bring the academic community together to discuss Afghanistan's future, and hopefully soon they will be talking about more concrete ways for development and prosperity for Afghanistan. And we hope that we will be able to bring you again and again through this forum. The design and the implementation of this conference was made possible through the continuous support from the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., but also we have had generous support from some donors to allow us to make this conference. And I would like to thank all of them for their contributions. Also, importantly, I would like to thank those colleagues of ours who have volunteered to manage and moderate the various panels. In particular, I'd like to mention Dr. Khalid Jahshan from Washington, D.C., Barnett Rubin from New York, Saeed Madadi from Kabul, Tamara Kharoub from Washington, and Lise Doucette, the Chief International Correspondent from the BBC from London, and my very own colleague, Sana Tariq. Without the combined effort of all these people and of our colleagues, both at the Center for Humanitarian Studies, Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, and the Arab Center, this conference would not have been possible. So to all of them, I would like to extend a very warm thank you and hope that as many of you will continue to follow the sessions with us, and there will be a daily briefing and using the social media. As my colleague has explained earlier, this conference is being simultaneously streamed in 4 languages, Pashto, Dari, Arabic, and English, on various social media channels that belong to the Arab Center. So with this, I will turn over the microphone to my colleague Khalil Jahshan to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Khalil, over to you.
Thank you, Sultan. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you from Washington, D.C. My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington. It is my pleasure this morning to represent ACW in serving as co-host with our friends and colleagues at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, headed by Dr. Sultan Barakat, of this very special conference focusing on peace in Afghanistan after the US NATO withdrawal. On behalf of all of my colleagues at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha, Qatar, and its branches and affiliates in Beirut, Tunis, Paris, I would like to welcome you to this three-day event and wish you productive and intellectually stimulating deliberations throughout the conference. This is essentially a conference, as Sultan just mentioned, of academic experts, some political analysts, some researchers, some current and former diplomatic practitioners with very extensive knowledge of the protracted conflict in Afghanistan and the recurrent attempts over the years at reaching a political solution acceptable to all parties and conducive to ending the fighting in the country. As it was just stated, Dr. Sultan Barakat is fond of telling those of us who are not necessarily as well versed in Afghani affairs, the Afghan peace process since its inception, frankly, over the past decade, but particularly the last couple of years, has suffered from knowledge gaps, as he calls them, regarding the positions and views of various parties to the conflict. I do not have to remind those of you who took an active part in various phases of the peace process and witnessed firsthand these knowledge gaps that have impeded efforts over the years to secure a lasting peace settlement. Unfortunately, however, these gaps have not dissipated, but seem to pop their head again and again at the various implementation stages of the February 2020 agreement, thus contributing to the creation of new and uncertain dynamics that require fresh examination and questioning to ensure viability and full implementation in the aftermath of the approaching deadline for US-NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan. The headlines just the past 48 hours, the New York Times, NBC News, Al Jazeera refer to these difficulties that we face at this time as we convene. This was exactly the motivation that prompted ACW and CHS to pool their energies and resources together in an honest attempt at plugging the knowledge gaps referred to earlier by seeking through our deliberations and subsequent publication of this conference proceedings to alleviate the dearth of rigorous analysis needed to buttress and complement the agreements reached by the parties. It is our hope that we're not being too naive or too ambitious in our rationale for this conference. And I have no doubt whatsoever that with the caliber of participants that we have graciously decided to join us this week, we will make a serious contribution to our objective in support of lasting peace in a country that has paid a heavy price in its pursuit of a better future for the Afghani people. I thank you all for your participation and wish you the best of luck in your upcoming discussion throughout the conference. Let me now move directly to our next component or part of the program. It is my distinct honor at this point to introduce our keynote speaker for day one in this three-day special conference, His Excellency Dr. Mutlaq bin Majid Al-Qahtani. Ambassador Al-Qahtani currently holds the post of Special Envoy of the Foreign Minister of the State of Qatar for Counterterrorism and Mediation of Conflict Resolution. He previously served as director of the Department of International Organization and Conferences in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Doha. He has held several international positions in the Qatari diplomatic corps, as well as the United Nations, among them chef de cabinet of the president of the 66th session of the United Nations General Assembly back in 2011, 2012, legal advisor to the Minister of State of Foreign Affairs from 2010 to 2011, Deputy Permanent Representative of Qatar at the United Nations between 2005 2008. Dr. Al-Qahtani clearly possesses extensive expertise in the fields of counterterrorism, conflict mediation, preventive diplomacy, and dispute settlement in international law. He has earned his PhD in public international law from Glasgow University in the United Kingdom and an LLM from the American University here in Washington, D.C. He's a member of several international academic and legal institutions and has written various articles relating to international law, international courts and tribunals, the law of treaties, and the law of international organizations. He has participated in many regional and international conferences, workshops, and other academic conventions. In 2015, Dr. Al-Qahtani was awarded the Ambassador of Peace Award by the Universal Peace Federation, in addition to winning the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR's award for Best Negotiator in 2020. He has played a key role over the past few years in the Afghani talks mediated by the State of Qatar. It is our pleasure at this point to introduce to you His Excellency Ambassador Mutlaq Al-Qahtani. Ambassador, please go ahead.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Dr. Sultan Barakat. Thank you very much, Dr. Khalil Jashan. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor and privilege to participate in this extremely and timely conference. I know you rightly indicated that there might be a gap in the knowledge, and try to fill this gap with having this kind of conferences and having this kind of discussions. As I said, it's an honor to participate and to contribute to these discussions. I don't have a written statement to deliver. I don't have a written remark to deliver, and that was on purpose. And the purposes have to stimulating and positive and constructive discussions and Q&As with the participants. Since this is informal conference, I will participate in my personal capacity as a person who would like to highlight and extend my experience and share with you my humble, very humble experience in this conflict. As you rightly said, this is as timely, and because it comes after the U.S. declaration to withdraw from Afghanistan. But that withdrawal is in accordance with the Doha Agreement. So legally, technically, it's not a surprise, and that was inevitable in accordance with the Doha Agreement. I think it's important to put some highlight or to highlight how we reached to the Doha Agreement. There have been a lot of challenges, a lot of obstacles that we have faced in a year or so of very intense and very complicated and very complex peace process. One of the most challenges that we have faced is it's quite unique negotiations. It's quite unique peace talks when you have a major or a superpower negotiating a deal with a movement or a group which is still, as we speak, recognized and designated as a terrorist organization. And those who were negotiating the deal was designated by the Security Council as such. So that's in itself is a quite unique features of the talks. Second things that there was no rules and procedures to govern and to rule and to organize, regulate the talks. There was no formal mediator or mediation, but we managed to play in a gradually and formally to more formally a facilitator and mediator till we reach the Doha Agreement, which you indicated, that was signed by the parties in 29 February 2020. Those who do not know about the agreement is composed of 4 elements. Number 1 is the counterterrorism, that Taliban will not allow Afghanistan soil to be used by terrorist organizations or terrorist individuals. Second is the withdrawal of international coalition forces from Afghanistan. And third, the start of inter-Afghan negotiations. And 4, which is the ceasefire, comprehensive and permanent ceasefire. I would say the first 2 points was, or this talks, or this agreement lead to the start of the inter-Afghan negotiations, which started in 12 September 2022, after decades of non-talking, after decades of fighting, and without any hope that Afghans will sit one day and to discuss their differences in a peaceful manner. The parties thought at the beginning that they will solve their differences without mediators or facilitators, for reasons that I personally either do not want to comment on, or I personally do not know the rationale behind it. But from day one, we felt, and we still believe, that a process without mediation is bound to fail. The parties kept talking for 62 or 63 days to discuss the rules and procedures. Nevertheless, they could not achieve such agreement. Then they sought the help of the facilitation or the mediation of Qatar. Then we intervened and took 3 weeks to make the parties, or to help the parties to reach a kind of agreement on the rules and procedures. The next day, they even also agreed to a joint statement. Many might think agreeing on the rules and procedures or agreeing on a joint press statement is minor development, but in my personal opinion, that was a quite major development, because it did generate some kind of a trust. It helped building some kind of a trust between the parties. Unfortunately, both sides wanted to break for a break, although we thought they could have continued without having a break. But what happened from January till May, there are a lot of developments that happened in this particular conflict that the Afghans themselves maybe should not be blamed for this. There are some external and political developments. I think we are aware of what was happening in January in Washington, the transition in Washington, the policy review in Washington in February, the talks and the discussions about the Istanbul conference in March, the withdrawal in April announcement, and in May, the Eid and the break and the Ramadan at that time. So I think this development has a negative impact on the process, but I think it's the right time has come, which is where we are now after the withdrawal. The withdrawal announcement, it makes it clear that for the parties, they have no other options, either to negotiate a deal or to fight. I think having discussions with Taliban and the government that winning this war militarily is not an option. Why? Because we do believe that nobody and no party can win this war militarily. For us, we have certain beliefs about the process and how the process should be moving forward. As I said, there is no military solution to this, and the only solution is through talks. The withdrawal of the United States or the international coalition forces left the parties without other options, and the only option is to either talk or fight. And I think if the parties do not take this opportunity after the withdrawal is completed, then there's a great chance that there will be a kind of fragmentations and the proliferations of groups, and there might be also a fragmentation of conflicts and proliferation of conflicts that might lead the country and take it into a civil war. I think spending times and speaking about ceasefire or reduction of violence at this particular stage of time is not practical, although it's desirable, at least for two reasons. One, there is a power or security vacuum in Afghanistan, and I think that should be filled. Second, from technical or tactical point of view, the parties might need to fight and negotiate to strengthen their negotiation position on the table. Spending some time and talking about the delisting, I think it's not logical. Maybe most of you do not know that Osama bin Laden is still under sanction. Maybe most of you don't know that Mullah Umar is still under sanction. So even if you're dead, you will remain under sanction. So the only way to overcome this is through the political discussions or political means. Maybe it's difficult to be delisted, but it's very easy to be listed. Spending time to talk about the prisoner release, I think it's also is not practical, at least for two reasons. It's not easy to release prisoners in a short period of time, so that will waste our main focus and discussions. And second, there's claims from the government that those who got released went back to the battlefield and fight the government. So I think it's not maybe logical for the government to release prisoners at this point in the light of the international forces withdrawal. I think what's important today, as we said, is to agree on a time frame of negotiations, to agree on a specific agenda. I'm quite sure that if you're going to propose an agenda item on climate change, I think you're wasting the times of the Afghan people, with all due respect. I think if you're going to speak about weathers and urbans, which I think is important, but yet this is not the immediate and the major issues that the Afghans should focus on. From our assessment, the major issue is power, whether you call it power sharing or dividing or participating, any kind of system you want to call it, any kind of name you want to put forward, I think it's up to them, but it's more importantly, it's about the power. It's about the system. It's about the future government. But for that reason, we worked on a non-paper and shared it with the parties last week, composed of 6 elements. And one of the most elements is to agree on a mediation and to agree on a time frame and to agree on agenda, and the time frame should end before 9/11. We sincerely believe that we should not be competing over Afghanistan, but rather we should be united over Afghanistan. We should cooperate with each other to bring peace in Afghanistan. But more importantly, I think the Afghan people should not allow others to intervene in their domestic affairs or their future politics. There's no country, nobody can intervene in any country unless the people of that country pave the way for others to intervene in their internal affairs. The conflict in Afghanistan is an Afghan conflict, and this process should be Afghan-owned, Afghan-led. And the Afghan themselves are the one who's going to fail or to make this process successful. I don't want the Afghan to look at this as non-Afghan issues, but I know it's a challenge to balance the interest of the key regional players and beyond. But I think this is a golden opportunity in the coming months, the coming 2 months, the coming 70 days is extremely important for the future of Afghanistan and the Afghan people. I'm sorry if I take long, but I'm more than happy to answer your questions if you have.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Al-Qahtani, particularly for helping us focus our attention at this conference on the need for additional mediation, particularly as it pertains to a new time frame agreed to by all parties, an agenda, and specifically, as you refer to it, as power sharing regarding the shape of future government in Afghanistan, all before the deadline of 9/11. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Al-Qahtani has been gracious, as he said earlier in the early part of his remarks, to welcome some of your questions. I know we have been receiving questions on the Q&A function of your Zoom page. Continue to send your question on that. If you prefer to email to send your question via email, feel free to do that at events@arabcenterdc.org, events@arabcenterdc.org. Let me start with the first question. This one comes from Ahmed Shiwa. After the US withdrawal, will Doha still play as the mediator for the Afghan peace negotiations, maybe the same role that you referred to, Dr. Qahtani, as mediator?
Well, thank you very much. I think this is important questions, and thank you for Brother Ahmed for raising this. I got to be honest with you. The parties have not yet finalized their agreement with respect to the mediation. One party need 2 mediators, while the other party need 1 mediator. And the proposal we're making is to have a compromise proposal, which is a leading mediator with the right to consult when if it's necessary, and with whoever sees appropriate for technical support and consultations. Yes, Qatar will stand ready to help and to mediate this conflict if it was asked by the parties unequivocally. We are not we do not think facilitation is enough. They need formal mediation. We're not talking about arbitration. It's mediation that the mediator opinions and decisions and the proposals are not binding. A mediator that understands the cultural sensitivity of the conflict. A mediation that help the parties to reach a peace settlement. A mediator that's impartial and will do the mediation in full conformity with international law. This is actually our understanding of the mediation. So we stand ready for that, and we expect the parties to come to us very soon, very soon about their final position. They're almost there.
Ambassador Al-Qahtani, I know you're here as you indicated in your personal capacity rather than representing the Qatari Foreign Ministry. But let me embarrass you just a little bit or push you a little bit in this regard. I was surprised by the statement Friday by our dear friend, the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Qatar from Cairo, saying that no tangible progress on Afghanistan yet. What is meant by that? What is the Qatari position that he was referring to?
Yes, I understand where you're coming from, and I have the same frustration, to put it quite bluntly. I personally experienced this when I see Taliban and the Republic delegation in December last year, 7 months ago. Yes, they spent like 62 days discussing rule procedures, and a couple of days they joined press statement to resume the talks in January. But you have no idea, Jamal, what was happening that night. When both sides is coming to me personally and said, we need to help the other side. And the other side is coming to me and said, we need to help the other side. You have no idea the level of collaboration between the two sides and to what extent they managed to build tremendous confidence. And that's what was needed at that time. But there was some kind of interruption, some kind of external elements, maybe beyond their control, which made us believe that there is no significant progress since December, to be honest with you. And all this external political developments since January till May made the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Foreign Affairs, to say there is no significant progress. And I think I agree with him. There is no significant progress. But are we saying there is no hope? No, of course, there is hope as long as the parties are meeting. And I think the withdrawal by the US put the parties on the hot seat. You have no other options, either to finish your differences before September 11, or God knows what's going to happen. There might more groups to come, and then the fight will expand. And this is quite dangerous. So it's a historical responsibility upon all the Afghans and the Talibans, and all the Afghans. Talibans are Afghans leaders, and history will judge them if they are going to take advantage of this golden opportunity or miss it. For Qatar, we stand ready to help them if our help is needed.
Ambassador, the next question comes from Suhasini Haidar from New Delhi. Recently, Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar had meetings with the leadership in Doha, as well as US Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad. How does Qatar see India's role in Afghanistan, and what ways can India in what ways can it cooperate during the US pullout? Are talks between India and Pakistan being discussed as part of the Afghanistan reconciliation process?
Well, I know this is very complicated questions, to be honest with you, but I think we should not, Afghanistan soil, or as a country, should not be become a place for a proxy among any countries. Yes, it's in the interest of Pakistan to have more stable Afghanistan. It's in the interest of India, of course, to have more stable Afghanistan. We understand Pakistan as a neighboring country, India as a country that, according to the, as far as we know, invested a lot economically in Afghanistan, and of course they want Afghanistan to be more peaceful and stable. And I understand that there has been a quiet visit by Indian officials to India to speak with the Taliban. Why? Because not everybody is believing that Taliban will dominate and take over, but because Taliban is a key component of or should be, or is going to be a key component of the future Afghanistan. So I see the reason behind having a dialogue or talks or reaching out to all parties in Afghanistan. But it's important to keep in mind that we are in a critical stage at this time, and I think if any meeting is going to take place, it should be for a major or one main reason, which is to encourage the parties to solve their differences by peaceful means. And this is a golden opportunity for all of them to take advantage. Otherwise, nobody is going to recognize, at least as far as Qatar is concerned, we are not going to recognize any group or any system or any group or any people who are going to take the country by force. So it's in the interest of everybody to have more stable Afghanistan, and this is what it is.
In light of this, what is exactly the role of the UN Secretary's representative, Arnaud?
Well, thank you very much for, we value and appreciate the United Nations role. United Nations represent international community as a whole. It's good for the process to collaborate with the United Nations, and I think the United Nations represents everybody. So I haven't met the gentleman yet. He's supposed to come next week or the week after to Doha to have more consultations with us. There might be some kind of misperception about his role, whether he's a regional coordinator or he's a potential mediator or a special consultant to the Secretary General of the United Nations. We have no view about his role. We haven't met him yet, and we are more than happy to see him and to see to what extent we can collaborate together for the good cause.
The next question comes from Sarah Al-Hajri. Are there any plans for Qatar to be part in the reconstruction process in Afghanistan?
Well, I think this is a premature thing to discuss at this point, but I believe not only Qatar, many countries, many organizations, including the European Union, the United Nations, and other key players, they want to have more developed and more, they want to see Afghanistan to be reconstructed. I'm not going to say Afghanistan is not totally destroyed, but I think countries, maybe like us, will be less enthusiastic to engage in a reconstruction plan without genuine peace settlement, without a genuine peace agreement agreed upon by all sides.
Thank you very much. Let's conclude with this last question from one of the attendees in the conference who prefers to remain anonymous. To Ambassador Al-Qahtani, how do you assess the willingness of the two sides from your perspective to actively engage in a peace process? We understand that the full delegations have rarely all been in Doha at the same time. How do you assess their willingness to participate fully?
Well, thank you very much. I hope I know who put this question forward, but I would like to give him or give her credit. I think this is extremely important question to end with, and take it from me, I'm cautiously optimistic. That's my short answer. And I think I see at least the overwhelming majority in both sides, they are interested in making peace. How? That remains to be seen.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Qahtani, again, for your valuable keynote remarks and for your gracious willingness to engage the participants in the Q&A session. Thanks again, and we hope to see you in future events in this regard. Sultan, back to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Khalil. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Qahtani. This has been absolutely wonderful. And I think a lot of what you've said is probably not known to everyone, particularly within the academic circles. The complexity which you've described, the fact that Qatar has continued to be a willing facilitator, but not necessarily within a structured format, and the challenges that has imposed on the process are very, very, very important points to emphasize. So thank you very much for the honest view in which you've shared this knowledge with us. And this leads us really smoothly into our first panel. For this conference, our first panel has been structured around the theme of complexities of the formal peace process. And I think Dr. Qahtani has just given us a glimpse of this from where he sees it as a third party, a party that has no direct necessarily strategic interest with either side, but has shown the willingness to progress the peace talks as much as possible. And to explore this theme in more depth, academic depth, as also historical depth, as we've said earlier, we have four very distinguished speakers who I shall introduce in a minute, who've been asked to reflect on the process or what is known of it so far, and to see if there are parallels that they can draw from their experiences, and in particular to dig deep into why, from their perspective, they think those obstacles have risen and have not been able to be removed over the last couple of years, and what can be done to move things forward. We're all familiar and aware now of the US-Taliban agreement that was struck or signed on the 29th of February 2020. And we're also aware of some of the controversy that followed that agreement, in that maybe sides American Republic has agreed on behalf of the government of certain elements that the government has not made commitment for, and so on, and the complication that has created, leading to the situation we're in today, where the final withdrawal, which was one of the elements, as Dr. Qahtani mentioned earlier, of the agreement, was postponed from the 1st of May to the 11th of September 2021. Luckily, or at least optimistically, the Taliban has not rejected or withdrawn from the process as a result of this. They may have shown some dissatisfaction with the move, but overall they seem to have remained in the process and have come back to the process. And those of you who are following the developments would have noticed the statement that was put out yesterday by Mullah Brother, in which he tried to explain to the world the broad brush approach of the movement to the future of Afghanistan. To help us understand all of this and to reflect deeper on the issues, we will now engage in this discussion for about an hour first, to give our 4 speakers 10 to 15 minutes each. And then we have a 30-minute for discussion. But before I introduce the speakers, I'm reminded here by my technical colleagues of the need to remind you all of the translation. If you are wanting to listen to this in English, then the icon is English on the Zoom function. Pashto is Pashto. For Dari, unfortunately, there's no equivalent to Dari with the Zoom at the moment, so you need to choose Chinese. And for Arabic, also, there is no equivalent, and you need to choose Spanish.
Dr. Sultan, let me thank you very much, if I may interrupt you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sultan. Thank you very much, Dr. Khalil, and thank you for the invitation. And I look forward to see you in Doha, and I wish you all the best in your conference and your discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan. To start with our first panelist today, we have with us Faiz Zaland. Faiz Zaland is a professor of public administration and policy at Kabul University, and he is also a PhD candidate in philosophy and political science at Al-Farabi National University of Kazakhstan, where he got a distinguished scholarship to continue with his work for his PhD. He received his master's degree from Germany, and he specializes and has written extensively on issues of state building, governance, peace building, and conflict resolution in Afghanistan. Mr. Zaland is known for his strong opinions in Kabul, and but also for his strong and in-depth analysis of the context in his country, and is one of the very few people who have been able to bridge the divide between the two sides, the Taliban movement and the government in Kabul over the last few years. So we'll start with Zaland, and then I'll introduce the speakers one by one as we reach them. Mr. Zaland, are you with us?
Yes, please.
Right. Well, if you can, please just give us the highlights of your intervention. We have around 10 minutes or so.
Mm-hmm.
The floor is
thank
yours.
you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much, Mr. Barakat. Thanks to Mr. Khalil and everybody in the room. I'm very much glad having the opportunity and present. I will be. I will be. Sorry, I'm in Kabul, so both electricity and internet connectivity both are troublesome. So it will be weak. I will try my best. I have already tried my best to keep the electricity full enough for my computer and having the best internet connection. So I will be presenting the complexities around the formal peace process of Afghanistan. With the year 2021, we are almost crossing or reaching to 42nd year of conflict in Afghanistan. The Afghanistan conflict is pretty much multidimensional. It involves Afghan people historical perspective that I want to indicate is that the conflict in Afghanistan over the past 4 decades has been so virulent that any peace plan gets trapped by domestic contradictions, internal dimension of the Afghan conflict, and also regional rivalries, which is the external dimension of the Afghan conflict, and the geopolitical ambitions of the neighboring countries, especially Pakistan, India, Iran, and Central Asian countries. So Afghanistan is once more on the brink of opening a new chapter in its history after the 20 years of invasion and conflict. Since after nearly 2 decades of extensive US military aid and training, the Afghan security forces continue to be plagued by serious operational problems that have been enabled the Taliban to contest more than half of Afghan districts. Conflict is now overlapping from direct conflict of US-NATO versus Taliban. It is getting some kind of internal, which we can say already we are on the brink of civil war. Right now, I'm sitting and presenting my presentation. There is fight going on between local militias and Taliban in north, especially Jozjan, Saripul, Faryab, and Mazar, and Takhan. Local commanders was directly. Main challenges to Afghan formal peace process, I'm going to highlight 4 of them. First is after the signature or signing of the peace agreement between US and Taliban, the partial implementation of this agreement. That is one of the main issues. The agreement which indicated 4 main points to be implemented in 14 months, that has overlapped from 14 months, which was the beginning of 1st of May. So it has not been implemented fully. Taliban claims that it must be implemented. They usually claim that they respect the Doha agreement and they want the release of prisoners and they want the delisting to have a meaningful intra-Afghan peace talks. The second very important problem is currently the challenge that peace process faces, that is the hasty withdrawal of US and NATO forces by September, which seems almost completed because all over the provinces they have been withdrawn. Only I think in Kabul we have few of those forces. It is just confirmed that yesterday, 20th of June, Bagram Air Base is also been the withdrawal is completed. It's officially delivered to Afghan forces. So third one is the presence of dominant opposing visions for Afghan peace process, not only in Kabul, but from the side of Taliban in the region also. Lack of political consensus. Today, Mr. President Ashraf Ghani, he called for a national conference on leaving to DC, but this Hikmat, the leader of Hizb Islami, one of the strongest Tanzim in Afghanistan, he didn't attend the meeting, and also Salahuddin Rabbani, who is the second and the strongest Tanzim political party, Jamaat Islami representative, he didn't attend. So still there is lack of consensus on approach from the side to the peace process. I'm again sorry. On the other side, the Talibans are getting momentum on fighting from outskirts to districts and now to the provincial centers, especially in the north. They are getting more momentum on their conquering strategy rather than going for smoothly to a peace process or peace talks on the table. So talk and fight strategy somehow applied by the Taliban is getting more momentum than talk and fight strategy from Afghan government side. It adds to the complexity of the formal achievements of the formal peace process. What are the proposals? The proposal that is getting from Mr. Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan, and the Republican is ceasefire first, and then the removal of sanctions, release of prisoners, recognition of Taliban as political party, conduct of fresh election, and review of constitutions. So this is in line that the proposal coming from the Republican side, while the Taliban are pressing for the implementation of the Doha Agreement and a release of the remaining prisoners, removal of sanctions, no direct talks to the Afghan government, and then calling for national consensus. These proposals, if we go through, they are very much conflicting, very much against each other somehow, because to the Doha Agreement, which happened between Taliban and US, Afghan government and the Republican was not a party. While now getting into that party, bringing them to a robust, important partner, I think it seems difficult, and the trust deficit on the table is something which is increasing this distance. What is needed? How can we solve? What are the solutions? What are the proposals? The first is the reconciliation and conflict resolution requires acknowledgement of differences. The differences on the must be acknowledged thoroughly. The attitude to solve these discussion must change from all sides. Compromises, maybe some of the very hard compromises must be made, and the parties must get prepared for that. The UN diplomacy must get robust, and the shuttle diplomacy must get more involved. The formal mediations, Mr. of the Doha, the Qatar government, their experience, and with the addition of now the new characters that are coming, like Turkey, Moscow, and we have UN on the ground. So if they can be supported, and especially the UN as an unaligned partner to all over the world, to the different conflict management proposals, the shuttle diplomacy must be robust and strength to create an understanding and compromise ground for both parties. So I will finish with George Tanya's very famous proposal regarding the history, that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. If you are not learning it as an Afghan, if our leaderships on all sides, if they are not learning from our past history and the problems that we faced during 40 years of war, especially regarding the peace attempts that were made during Soviets, and then after that, the Geneva Pact with Dr. Najib's government, and then between warring partners, the civil warring, and then with Taliban. And now, if you are not learning from those past attempts, I think we are just right on the brink of a civil war. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Zeland. I think you've highlighted a number of interesting points to come back to in the discussion, including the difficulty in terms of the absence of a formal mediation process, as you put it, and also the fact that maybe parties continue to believe in the value of fighting and talking at the same time, but maybe they don't have equal advantage of that strategy. But we'll come back to this in our discussion time. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Barney Rubin. Barney Rubin is a senior fellow at the Center on International Cooperation at New York University, where he previously directed the Afghanistan-Pakistan regional program, and is currently an associate fellow of our Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies in Doha. From 1994 to 2000, he was director of the Center for Preventive Action and director for Peace and Conflict Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Between 1990 and 1996, Rubin served as an associate professor of political science and director of the Center for the Study of Central Asia at Columbia University. Before that, he was a Peace Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace and assistant professor of political science at Yale University. He has been following Afghanistan very closely for a number of years. I would say more than 20 years. He's been one of the main authors on Afghanistan, and he has acted as an advisor to various US administrations, in particular between 2009 and 2013, as well as special advisor to the UN Special Representative of the Security General for Afghanistan in 2001. So I will hand over now to Barney to help us understand the complexities from his point of view. Barney.
Well, thank you very much, Sultan. And I'd like to thank you and the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies in Doha and Khalil Jahshan, my old classmate, and two of us were in school at the University of Chicago with Zalmay Khalilzad, much more than 20 years ago. And all those people who have helped in putting this very complex and very productive conference together. In light of what Sultan said at the beginning about the attempt to bring some scholarship to bear on this analysis, I'd like to mention a theory about peace negotiations in civil conflict, which is sometimes used to analyze the Afghan negotiations and explain, not that it's totally wrong, but explain how the structure of this conflict adds different dimensions to it. I'm referring to the thesis that the parties to the conflict seriously negotiate when they reach what is known in the literature as a hurting stalemate. That is, they are both suffering and neither one thinks that they can win through the increased application of force, and therefore they have no alternative but to try to reach some kind of a negotiated solution. Now, the problem lies with the last statement, that they have no alternative but to reach a negotiated solution. Because in the case, one thing to remember about Afghanistan is that it was established in its current form by an agreement between imperial powers. And it was established in order to be dependent. That is, it was the original treaty with the British government provided for regular subsidies to the centralized Afghan government to maintain control of the territory. And without going further into the history, not only is the Afghan state today and the Afghan government aid dependent, and it is, according to World Bank statistics, the 5th most aid dependent country in the world, and that's an understatement because that does not include military assistance. But not only the government, but all political parties and actors in Afghanistan also rely on external assistance, because Afghanistan is also, I think, officially the 13th poorest country in the world, and war is very expensive. So the result is that, and here just to state the obvious, the Afghan government and the various actors on the Republic side depend for funding on a coalition led by and very much dominated by the United States. And there's been a lot of emphasis on the military side, which is now being withdrawn, but still the finances of the Afghan government, the finances of the security forces are dependent on funding and on technical assistance from the United States. Now, on the other side, and I'll add, one of the aspects of being dependent on the United States, of course, is that the United States is very mutable and also somewhat fragmented and undergoes leadership transitions and has different actors and so on. On the other side, the Taliban receive funding from taxing activities in Afghanistan, including American assistance as it transits through areas they control. But the main point is that their headquarters, their leadership is in Pakistan. And that enables them to protect themselves from American air power, because we're not American and Afghan air power. So that it's not so much that Pakistan provides them with financial assistance. I think they have other forms of funding or a lot of direct military assistance. So that certainly it does to some extent. There are advisors. But the Taliban have become embedded in certain sectors of Pakistani society. They raise funds through charities. They have relationships with political parties, religious institutions, and they are not under threat in their daily activities, and they are shielded from the air power of the other side by their presence in a foreign country. In addition to which, while in private, Pakistani interlocutors, such as especially in the military, now I understand, and so even when I was in the government, had a much more direct and open willingness to discuss this matter. Officially, Pakistan still denies it. You may have seen that in recent days, the foreign minister of Pakistan, Mr. Qureshi, had an interview with Lutfullah Najifzadeh from Tulu Television, in which he said there is no Taliban sanctuary in Pakistan. So I think at this point, no one was claimed that Pakistan is responsible for the war in Afghanistan, and and that there are no other causes to it or anything like that. But the fact is that the United States and in a different way Pakistan are both parties to these talks. Of course, there's a formal way that they're parties to them, and that the United States at least is party to the talks, and that was through the sequencing that the Taliban insisted on. That first they had to reach agreement with the United States, then they would talk to what they call other Afghan sides. But the fact is that was very much confused by the fact that the Doha Agreement, which they want implemented, requires the United States to do things that are not within its power to do. That is to release prisoners from Afghanistan and to end sanctions on the Taliban from the UN Security Council. The first requires the agreement of the Afghan government because at the end of President Karzai's administration, the United States transferred authority for prisoners to the Afghan government. And the second, of course, requires the agreement of the other members of the Security Council, which include not only the permanent members at the moment, which of course Russia, China, etc., but also India is currently a member of the Security Council and therefore can block action by unanimity. So what that means is, but from the Taliban point of view, they are still delivering things to the United States through the counterterrorism aspect of the agreement. And by refusing and have leverage because of refusing a ceasefire. So from the Taliban point of view, when they want concessions from the other Afghan side, their main strategy, actually, of course, on the one hand, they're trying to move militarily on the ground, but their main strategy is to try to influence the United States, not to negotiate with the Afghan government, but to try to use influence with the United States to get the Afghan government to change its position. Now, on the other side, all the Afghan governments and most of the Afghan political spectrum, which is represented in the delegation, also are very much aware of the Taliban's dependence on Pakistan. And I might add that both sides are dependent, but neither side is controlled by those on whom they depend. That is, the Afghan government does not act on the instructions of the United States, and the Taliban does not act on the instructions of Pakistan. The United States and Pakistan are capable of undertaking actions that affect especially the military capacities of the two sides, but they are not capable of changing their minds. So there's a limit to how much you can get that way. But the Afghan government has always taken the position that really it is up to Pakistan and the United States and other international powers with influence on Pakistan to bring the Taliban to the table, and not only that, but to decrease their ability to engage in these military tactics that are putting pressure on the Afghan government. So that is why you see, on the one hand, the Taliban, who have direct contact with the United States daily in Doha, making statements addressed to the United States. Afghan government making statements addressed to Pakistan. Invite, of course, General Bajwa, the Chief of Army Staff, has come to Kabul frequently, and Salman Khalilzad frequently goes to Islamabad. And I might add that while the United States has changes of government and changes of policy, Pakistan does not, at least with respect to its national security policy, because that is run by the Pakistan military, which is not subject to elections. And it has a succession process which is more similar to the Chinese Communist Party than to the United States. That is, there's institutional continuity with respect to the Pakistan military. So that the Taliban's support is more reliable, and simply for geographic reasons. After all, Pakistan is always going to be next to Afghanistan, and the two populations will always be overlapping. Afghanistan will always be landlocked, although not everyone in Afghanistan believes that. They sometime eventually they may take back their old territory, but they will not in the foreseeable future. And therefore, Pakistan is in a sense in a stronger position because it's not going to withdraw. It doesn't have that option. Now, what can we do about that? Because everyone agrees, at least verbally, that the solution is negotiations among Afghans, and that it should be Afghan-owned and Afghan-led. And yet, the international actors not only are important in trying to achieve their own goals, but the fact that they exist changes the negotiation strategies of the Afghan participants, because they always have the option of trying to influence the international backers of the other side. And I think that I hate to use the word should, because that's like saying that you don't know what to do. In addition, one approach to that problem would be to strengthen the mediation and strengthen the role of, in particular, the United Nations, since all the backers of both sides are members of the United Nations. But the fact is, neither the United States nor Pakistan has shown itself to be very receptive to a United Nations role. Even if they accept it in the talks among Afghans, they don't accept the United Nations role in their national security policy. Nonetheless, it is possible that a stronger UN role would enable the mediator to see how those interrelationships are developing in the course of the negotiations and to intervene in an appropriate way. But ultimately, I think it is the responsibility of the international actors to do much more than they have thus far, I think, to impress on the Afghans that they cannot get the international actors to deliver the other side to them, and that they will not be supported in taking power by force, as Dr. Patani said, or in simply trying to stall. I'm not that confident that that will happen. It requires a level of commitment and coordination that we haven't very much seen. But I think, as Professor Zalan said, that the alternatives are quite grim to contemplate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barney, and thank you for sticking to the time, as did Zaland. We're going very well so far, so thank you very much. Thank you also for emphasizing the point that although the two sides may be dependent on others, they are not necessarily controlled by others. So there is a good degree of autonomy and possibility of reaching a settlement if that's what they choose to do. Also, I thought the point you made earlier about the theoretical aspect that they have no option but to reach a negotiated settlement may not actually necessarily apply at the moment, and it may not be in the interest of all sides as we speak. We'll come back to you, Barney, for when we start our discussion. But now I'd like to introduce our third speaker. Our third speaker is Mrs. Meredith Preston McGay, and Meredith comes to us with an experience It is more than 20 years of addressing issues of conflict and instability in Asia and in Africa, in some of the most troubled situations. She has worked in the Myanmar border, in Kosovo, in northern Iraq, several African countries over the years. She was the Africa Regional Director for the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And on October the 1st, 2019, she joined the Global Center for Pluralism as its Secretary General. Meredith has a particular take on what is going on in Afghanistan, and is someone who believes that the diversity of the country is a strength and can be employed in a way to achieve peace. While as some of us may have grown a little bit cynical about the diversity issue because it has created so many divisions over the years, Meredith and her colleagues are in a slightly different camp. And we are all looking forward to hearing from you, Meredith, as how you propose, based on your research and evidence, to build on diversity as a strength for peace in Afghanistan. Meredith, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Sultan, thank you very much, and good morning, good evening to all of you. I'm so pleased to be joining such a distinguished panel, and thank you, Sultan, and to the organizers for such a thoughtful program over these 3 days. As I was introduced, I'm Meredith Preston-McGee. I'm the Secretary General for the Global Center for Pluralism. I'm based here in Ottawa, where I reside on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I mention this to respect and acknowledge the Algonquin as the stewards of our land, and to remind all of us that Canada is also a nation that struggles with its history, with its diversity, and with reconciliation. As Sultan mentioned, I've spent more than 2 decades working on a range of peace processes around the world, and wanted to sort of use that experience to offer maybe a different approach to the complexities of the peace process in Afghanistan, recognizing the challenges, and certainly there is cause for cynicism and pessimism at this moment, but at the same time, I thought I would offer some ideas about how we might apply a different lens to the process now and in the future, and one that may offer new opportunities to challenge assumptions, to identify areas of common ground, or initiate new ways of engaging the main parties and all of the stakeholders to the conflict for sustainable peace in Afghanistan. So I wanted to speak specifically today about pluralism and diversity. As we all know, and as you mentioned, Afghanistan is a diverse and multi-ethnic, multilingual nation. We often think about this diversity along the lines of religion, language, ethnicity, gender. However, I think it's also important to think more widely as we imagine diversity in any society, but Afghanistan in particular, to think about geographic diversity, diversity between the provinces, between urban and rural populations, diversity of experiences with the conflict. Within ethnic groups, we would see clan-based, geographic, generational, social, class distinctions. And this rich diversity is part of what makes Afghanistan unique and strong, but of course has also greatly contributed to conflict over the last 45 years of war. And I see the challenge related to this in efforts to make peace in all of the places that I've worked in some of the most intractable contexts in the world. And we see this challenge of managing diversity as a driver of conflict in Afghanistan and other places. But what we're not seeing is a comparative focus on diversity as a strength, and therefore as a core component about how we design a peace process and how we build peace in the longer term. So we've been thinking about what tools could be offered to help the parties and help others utilize pluralism to reimagine the approach to the peace process, and to try and advance in a way that identifies common ground and builds positive responses to diversity rather than further entrenching division or exclusion. I'm very conscious that this isn't the solution. Complex systemic and historical problems and conflicts like Afghanistan require equally complex approaches for solutions that factor in a huge range of elements. We feel like pluralism can be one of these contributing elements. So I want to expand very briefly on what we mean by pluralism and why this is different from what we may think about as traditional inclusion, and then talk about how this would manifest itself in the peace process. So we all know that diversity in any society is a demographic fact. All societies are diverse, and they're diverse at all levels. Pluralism refers to the actions that positively respond to that diversity, to see it as the basis for a stronger society, rather than as a threat or something that needs to be violently overcome or suppressed. Responding to diversity like this, pluralism, looks different in every society. There's no model to adopt, but rather through an understanding of and commitment to valuing diversity, each society can chart its own path and take actions and make decisions that fit in that context. Pluralism is therefore not prescriptive about which differences matter. This is for the society to collectively examine and determine. So what we offer through pluralism is a lens to make better context-specific choices in a society and in the peace process. In the case of Afghanistan, for example, understanding pluralism and imagining this diversity within the context of Islam would be a particularly critical element. Developing societies that engage all of these different ways of life, requires that there's structures in place to help navigate difference constructively: laws, policies, constitutions, peace agreements. This is really the hardware of how one would manage diversity constructively. But it's not enough. It also requires the social norms, the narratives that are told by other groups in society, how your history is told. That's the sort of social software that's so critical for pluralism. And we see this as more transformative to some of the traditional inclusion approaches that have been used. Traditional inclusion often predetermines which differences matter, focusing specifically on issues of women and youth, which are not unimportant, but what it can do is pitting the parties against one another, centering around competition for representation at the formal talks. And this misses an opportunity to collectively examine the specific patterns of exclusion that have driven conflict, that could be based on race, ethnicity, religion, geography, class, caste, age, lifestyle, as well as gender. Inclusion too often focuses on pulling up a few chairs to a pre-existing table, rather than thinking more fundamentally about how peacemaking could be done differently. We recognize that making peace, particularly in Afghanistan, is difficult enough without adding additional layers of complication, new voices, new spaces, new issues to be agreed. The Afghan peace process is more difficult than most, and we recognize that. So why should the process use a pluralist lens? Firstly, and pragmatically, pluralism can help identify areas of common ground for discussion. Pluralism can help the parties address diversity within the society, but also within their own constituencies for very practical reasons of bringing different constituencies alongside to the agreement. It provides multiple and varied ways to engage these constituencies and address their concerns. We see consistently that inequalities, horizontal inequalities and marginalization are so strongly correlated both with the conflict onset, but also with conflict resurgence. We need pluralism to ensure more viable and long-lasting agreements once we get to that stage of the process. The process underway at the moment could entrench exclusionary zero-sum politics or help develop a culture of consultation and consensus building. If the process is now really about power, as Dr. Al-Qahtani referred to, how this power is expressed in support of the diversity of Afghanistan will be really critical for how the country moves forward in order to sustain whatever peace, whatever agreement is reached. And I'm really conscious that these ideas can feel quite theoretical when you're faced with the very real and current challenges and complexities of the process at hand. So I wanted to elaborate about how pluralism offers maybe some new approaches in each element of the peace process. We've broken this down into 6 interconnected elements: analysis, guiding principles, representation, consultation, agreement outcomes, and implementation. Analysis considers how a thorough and collective analysis of existing inequalities, existing diversity in the society could actually help the parties better examine these dominant divisions. And while they may not yet agree on how to address these issues, the analysis may suggest new items for the agenda of the talks, new communities to be consulted, and wider issues that may form the basis for confidence building measures. For example, conflict parties may have common ground around the need to address the historic marginalization of rural areas. Or we may find that a conflict which has manifested itself as an ethnic division may have strong interclass dimensions, which requires a different approach. Related to this, establishing pluralism as one of the guiding principles of the talks would seek to build on common ground from this analysis to ensure that compromises made during the negotiations would be sought within a set of limits that would not erode pluralism, erode protection of diversity in the longer term. We recognize the importance of representation, though see it not as the only field in which these issues should arise. And so the talks, of course, should reflect the diverse makeup of society, but we're also conscious that representation doesn't equal influence, and there's a range of challenges with assuming that a single individual represents a large and often diverse constituency. Inclusive delegations can't be forced or artificially constructed. When they are, they tend to be tokenistic and not have the sort of impact that we would like to see. It would be unreasonable, for example, to expect the Taliban to produce a delegation representative of all of the different elements of Afghan diversity for the talks due to the ethnic, social, and cultural makeup of the group. It would, however, be important for the sustainability of any agreement to encourage the group to include the principal factions themselves, as well as establishing consultative mechanisms with representatives of the population under the areas of their control. But formal representation in talks needs to be supplemented with broader consultation. We recognize that such processes of consultation and consultative assemblies, shura and jirga, for example, are rooted in Islamic and Afghan traditions, but we need to do more. Consultations need to be considered and agreed by the two parties so that the outcomes of these consultations are utilized by all of the actors in the process and not only one side. These consultations would need to be multi-platform to avoid exclusions due to geography, gender, socioeconomic status, digital connectivity, and so forth. In other contexts we've seen, these sorts of consultations can be useful to break deadlocks. Consultations can identify new approaches, which might enjoy overwhelming public support, perhaps across the spectrum of both progressive and conservative views, and sometimes to help identify responses to seemingly intractable issues. But such consultations need to engage all segments of the population, including those in harder to reach rural areas, and ensure that a range of views, both progressive and conservative, are heard. So we recognize also that the outcomes of the talks in Doha may be limited, and we think about some of the secondary processes that will be established in addition to ceasefire, issues of victims' rights and reconciliation, constitutional reform, and so forth. And incorporating a pluralist lens in each of these, again, offers new opportunities for common ground. I won't go through an exhaustive list of all of these, but wanted to illustrate a few examples. We often imagine that ceasefires and SSR processes are hard security elements, best left to military and military advisors. But what this can fail to address is that the relationship between the security services and the wider population will be central to the ability for the country to be at peace with itself in the future. So understanding the diversity of experiences and identities within the fighting forces, thinking about the diversity of the actors who may be involved to support the implementation of a ceasefire, these can add huge advantages to the success of security arrangements. SSR processes may also need to address issues pertaining to the mandate, role, and culture of the security forces. For example, exclusionary symbols and practices could be reassessed in the light of the emerging pluralistic ambitions of the state. For example, base names and symbols associated with the US occupation could be reviewed as a confidence building measure. Another example just to note in the area of victims' rights and reconciliation is that a holistic approach to reparations and the process of consultation with victims can look at how accountability builds a sense of reconciliation and belonging of victims in the wider society. This process of addressing the needs of victims is an opportunity to rebuild these social norms towards more peaceful resolution of conflict and build a national narrative that honors the various and diverse ways that groups have suffered, not only one side or the other. And finally, to power sharing. Understanding the nature of governance will need to be considered beyond the boundaries of the two parties at the talks in Doha and beyond the space of a transitional period. Commitments to advancing diversity across all elements of governance will be critical to ensure that these lines of power and their related divisions are not calcified now by what is meant to be a transitional arrangement. These are just a few examples I wanted to highlight about why pluralism can be both important but also useful in the process and throughout the substance of the discussions. I may be optimistically jumping ahead, but I did just want to touch on the importance of implementation when agreements are finally reached.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Sultan?
We've run out of time.
Sure.
Conclude, yeah.
Okay, sorry, let me just say that really the focus of this is to ensure that we have an evidence-based understanding of the equalities in society, to ensure that all groups have been considered within the agreement and that this offers a new space for dialogue between the parties. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meredith. I think this is very inspiring, and it offers a slightly different take on how one can turn the diversity and the multiplicity of viewpoint across the country into an advantage. We'll come back to you when we start the questions, but I would like you maybe just to consider this one from me, and then we'll come back. That there seems to be, for this to work, there's an assumption that there has to be a good degree of direct communication between the parties. And this is, as we've heard earlier from Dr. Qahtani, but also from Zaland, this is to be missing here. There is a side that does not recognize the other and refused for a long time to speak directly to them. And as you may know, 2 years ago, when we attempted to put together the first intra-Afghan talks here in Doha, the informal inter-Afghan talks, we were faced with this question: how many people can you, how far can you go down into the breakdown of the diversity of opinions to be represented? And I thought the point you made about having to think beyond direct representation is also an important one. We'll come back to it. Thank you very much. We'll move on now to our fourth and final speaker for this panel. We have with us Alex Thayer. Alex is the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. He's also a non-resident Senior Democracy Fellow at Freedom House and served as co-director of the Task Force on U.S. Strategy to Support Democracy and Counter Authoritarianism for a while. Alex has dedicated nearly 3 decades of addressing the world's most intractable challenges. And most recently, the last actually I met Alex was in London when he was the executive director of the Overseas Development Institute, a leading global think tank that examines causes and develops solutions for global challenges like migration, climate change, and state fragility. In 2010, Alex was appointed by President Obama to lead the U.S. Agency for International Development Programs in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the region. We welcome Alex with us, and he will, through his paper, address the issue of government and the complexity the negotiations have suffered from as a result of very, very different viewpoints of what the future government should look like. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Sultan. I trust you can hear me okay. I'm just going to start by reflecting on where and when Sultan and I met. In 1994, we were cavorting together with Afghan colleagues in Swat Valley. And I mentioned that because the purpose of that discussion was to look at how the international community cooperating with Afghans could further the peace process and to do no harm in our interventions in Afghanistan. And I think that, unfortunately, the jury is still very much out on whether we've achieved that. But I do want to acknowledge what an extraordinary job you've done over the years, Sultan, you and your colleagues, of sticking with this issue, and delighted to be part of this conversation today. I want to make one caveat here because I think it's incredibly important for many of the Afghans that I've worked with over many of the years, which is that any of the suggestions that I'm making, discussions that we're having about recommendations for how the peace process can succeed, are in no way, shape, or form meant to suggest that Afghans should be sacrificing their hope for democracy or their striving for rights. I have spent the last couple of decades, like so many on this conference, working with Afghans who have sacrificed everything, their lives, their families, in the search for peace, but also in the search for fundamental rights and freedoms. And I continue to support that, as I know many of my colleagues do. The other thing is that this process that the Afghans are engaged in is incredibly complex. And of course, there's no boilerplate or template that any of us is going to come up with how they can succeed. And in fact, hearkening back to what one of our early speakers in this panel said, you know, the problem with Afghans in peace talks may be not that they don't remember their past, but they remember it too well. The last several decades have had an endless series of unsuccessful peace talks between Afghans, between outside parties, sometimes both. And of course, the tragedy of this is that they have not been sustainable. They haven't found a platform that has fundamentally worked for Afghans or those seeking to undermine peace in Afghanistan. But we can't obviously only be constrained by that past, because of course there does have to be a future in which Afghans can find a sustainable peace. But I fear today that we are not as close to it as I would have hoped even a year ago. So I'm very going to briefly speak to, I think, the fundamental issues that I think are constraining the peace process, in addition to what the past speakers have said. The first is really fundamentally about this idea of the nature of the Afghan state and why that remains so unsettled and why it seems still to provoke potentially the likelihood of ongoing and deep conflict, and the need to identify common interests, the need to find space in the negotiations for compromise are still really fundamental. But you know, when I read the statement or the letter from Mullah Barader that came out over the weekend, I think it's very important to acknowledge that this discussion about thinking about possible shared futures has been very constrained by the fact, as one of the speakers said previously, that there has not been a lot of dialogue based on common premises. And in fact, that we've been trying so hard to read the tea leaves from past experience with the Taliban, while we have a written constitution on the Republic side, while we have 20 years of parliamentary fights and Supreme Court decisions, while we have a number of elections, all of these deeply problematic in many ways, but still provides a fundamental basis for political evolution among the sides that have been arguing for a republic versus a Taliban movement that has remained, I think, very much as a negotiating tactic, remained very enigmatic in their goals, and have made it very hard to have this conversation. So I think there's three big axes, but I'm really going to focus on the first one. The first is this idea of the republic versus the emirate, and just to kind of pull that apart a little bit. The second is on issues of centralization versus decentralization, which I think are fundamental to a sustainable future in Afghanistan. And the third are what we often call constitutional decision rules, or the simple question of who decides. I mean, ultimately, a lot of the outcome and whether Afghan parties see themselves in this agreement is not only whether it encompasses the diversity of Afghanistan, but whether they will see themselves in the future power structures of the country. So as I said, I think the Afghan government, republic, those parties are a little bit clearer in their approach because we have a constitution that clearly states the view of the nature of sovereignty. And I think it's just worth reminding us that the 2004 Afghan constitution established a republican form of government that was defined where sovereignty belongs to the nation, manifested directly and through its elected representatives. The nation of Afghanistan is composed of all individuals who possess the citizenship of Afghanistan. And this means ultimately that Afghanistan's citizens are entrusted with the power and responsibility to choose their representatives to govern, and that those representatives are accountable to the people, which is very similar to the 1964 Afghan constitution. And so the key attributes of the republic in the 2004 constitution are, first of all, that sovereignty is manifested directly through the people, its citizens. The second is that citizens choose their leaders through elections with universal suffrage. Everybody gets a vote. The third is that nobody is above the law, and laws are passed through an elected legislature. The fourth is that there are 3 independent branches of government that check each other's powers, so a system of checks and balances. And the fifth is that all citizens have basic rights which cannot be infringed. Now, let me contrast this to what we understand of Taliban thinking. There are many in this conference that understand it much more deeply than I do, but we can draw from their 1998 draft constitution, from some of their basic laws, from the 2005 draft constitution, and of course, many statements and things that have been written by the Taliban. The first is that the emir, the vision of sovereignty is one that is quite different. The Taliban's conception of an emirate is a state that is founded on the basis of Quranic text and ruled by an emir, the commander of the faithful, that is chosen by a limited group of Islamic qualified leaders. The emir in these documents has near absolute executive, legislative, and judicial authority, while hypothetically having the same rights and responsibilities as other Afghan citizens, but there are no provisions in many of those documents for any form of accountability for the emir. Individual rights and freedoms are subject to the limits of Islamic Sharia as determined by the emir and selected ulama. And so the key attributes of the emirate as described and practiced by the Taliban are sovereignty manifested through the implementation of Sharia, a leader chosen by a select Islamic Shura, all branches of government subject to the authority of the emir, and basic rights defined and limited by an Islamic Sharia as interpreted by the emir and that limited leadership. So I think it's quite important that to acknowledge that these systems do fundamentally differ in both their theorization and execution. And that is not to say that there aren't ways in which common ground can be found between them, but it is to say that there are some pretty fundamental precepts that are going to require fundamental compromise in any possible negotiation. But let me point out what I think are a couple of common principles, and then I'll come to some recommendations that I do think appear between both parties and could form important common ground for these negotiations. The first is that Afghanistan needs to be governed by an agreed written constitution that reflects Afghan values and traditions. All parties do say that there needs to be a constitution and that they do need to adhere to fundamental sort of Afghan traditions and values, which have some good governing principles. The second, of course, is that Afghanistan's government has to have a fundamentally Islamic character. The third is that Afghanistan must be sovereign, independent, and should have positive, peaceful relations with its neighbors. The fourth is that Afghanistan's governance should be inclusive of ethnic, sectarian, and geographic diversity. And I was glad to see some of those principles reiterated in the recent Taliban statement. And the fifth is that Afghanistan's territory cannot and should not be used as a safe haven or launching pad for Afghan terrorist groups or activities. But fundamentally underlying the problem of negotiations is not only these fundamental issues of the construct of the state, but a lack of trust. And the reason I point to the lack of trust as being so fundamental is because you not only have to agree to a system that meets your overall political philosophy, but you have to agree to one that you think is going to protect your interests in the long run. So it's not just about the creation of a transitional government, which may then move to a constitutional platform. It's not just about the creation of a government that may have checks and balances, that may find a path for the ulama, for example, in a constitutional court, that may have a mixed sort of parliament that has appointments. All of these things are possible. The problem is whether any Afghan party will see that in 5 years, in 10 years, let alone in 2 years, that their fundamental interests, that their rights, indeed their lives would be protected through that system. And so that is also going to be a fundamental challenge. So I'm just going to end with a few recommendations because I see I'm coming to time. The first is, as I already said, is articulating a set of constitutional principles that the negotiations can build on. The second, which I alluded to, is not to treat the republic versus emirate question as a binary. Every constitution on earth has a mix of national traditions. It has elected and appointed officials. It has qualifications for people in different positions. It has provisions which favor the majority balanced with those that are protecting rights. And so I don't mean to set this up as a conflict that cannot be negotiated, but I do think it's important for us to recognize those starting points. The third is finding a path of sovereignty that ultimately can accommodate both the sacred and the practical. In fact, Pakistan's constitution, its 1973 constitution, does this fairly well by saying that ultimate sovereignty belongs to God, but is delegated to the people to lead their country. And that ultimately temporal authority on the ground has to be exercised by the people, and that authority is placed in the people as a trust of God. So there are pathways that have been found in Islamic constitutions that can bring those together. The fourth rather, is that the separation of powers can be a fundamental safe harbor for the core interests of all of the parties. If you are worried about whether you have a future, then you want the separation of powers to find a way to check the powers of others. That is ultimately how factions come together. You don't have an ultimate winner and an ultimate loser, but a way of constraining power over time in the future. The fifth is that I believe that Afghanistan's diverse spheres of authority are ultimately an advantage. I'm not going to talk here about centralism versus decentralism, but whether it's the role of religious institutions in Afghan society, whether it's the role of local institutions like the shuras or local institutions that have been created formally through things like National Solidarity Program and others, there are places where Afghan authority exists and is exercised often much more capably than at the national level. And those should be a repository of authority that is an advantage for Afghanistan rather than a challenge. And then finally, the right to select leaders must be defined so as to prevent capture by a narrow group. No Afghan group that needs to see its future in this constitutional process and in a peace process is going to rely on a system that will replace all power into the hands of a narrow group. And ultimately, that will serve as a means of protection for all parties as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Very clear analysis and a clear set of recommendations on how the process may move forward. In particular, I think the emphasis on the fact that it does not have to be a binary position between the emirate discourse and the republic. And I think also the reference to the Pakistani constitution is an interesting way to put it. Also, given the emphasis Pakistan puts on democracy is quite interesting in the way they elect their leaders and so on, and the role in the region. We'll come back to all of this with a discussion now, which we have about just under half an hour to take some questions. I have a set of questions in front of me, but I will start with our audience first, and then I will come back to my issues. We have a question first addressed from one of our participants, Dr. Ahmad Harb, addressed to Dr. Zaland. Dr. Zaland, are you still with us?
Yes, please, I am here. You can't see me very well because the electricity has gone, but I am online.
Yeah, sorry. Well, thank you so much for staying with us. This question is addressed to you from Dr. Ahmad Harb. He's asking, what is the actual danger of a civil war in Afghanistan in the weeks and months to come? In your presentation, you referred to an ongoing conflict between some factions and the Taliban in the north of the country as we speak. And the question is, what is the real prospect from your point of view? And are there other parties in addition to the government and Taliban in action as at the moment?
Thank you so much. I think that is one of the main worry that Afghan as a nation is having. Afghan people for past few months, there is a big concern all over the country because there were attacks in Kabul and around the country, specifically against our brother Hazara minorities, which were based on their ethnicity and also religious aspect. Secondly, the fight which is going on in North, the government forces, which is the ANDSF, is leaving their posts and district centers, while local militias, people which were known previously as warlords or as opponents with Taliban in 1990s, they are taking their guns. They call themselves with the Pashto word or Dari word Pasunwal, which means the revolutionaries. So they take guns and they take over the district centers. In Takhar, in two of the Takhar district centers, it has recently happened that local militias or local people, which are non-governmental forces, they took over the districts which were taken by Taliban previously. So such a kind of fighting, which can provide ground for spoilers, not only nationally, but regionally also, for ethnically, religiously, and also with their previous strategies to interfere in Afghanistan's power game. They can reactive their progress inside the country, and rightly they can take us to civil war. But these all scenarios can happen only if we do not have a successful peace process. The current peace process, which is facing a deadlock, or it has been a stalemate, not only in Doha, but it didn't happen in Turkey, a conference which was mentioned in Blinken's letter to President Ghani previously, that there should be a conference in Turkey which should have a discussion between all Afghan sides on the peace process, which didn't happen. So such kind of failures can take the fight problem not only to civil war, but also to regional years, which previously have been happening. As Galtung rightly says about the theory of negative peace and positive peace, I think with the agreement to the Galtung's theory of negative peace, we were never in peace in past 20 years. We were in negative peace. Now, these potential spoilers, we can be taken to a civil war as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have another question. This comes from the social media, and maybe both Alex and Meredith, and if Barney would like to also jump in. It refers to the issue of diversity. Diversity is not just in terms of ethnicity and where people come from, but there seems to be a fundamental ideological difference. And Alex pointed to the fact that the Islamic character of the state, everybody seems to agree on this. But the question is saying that one side is seeking the purest form of Islamic state, which could be exclusionary to others, particularly those who have slightly more liberal understanding of the ideology and the religion and so on. Would that be, could that be ever bridged? I don't know, who'd like to have a go first, Alex, maybe?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it is a fundamental question, and one that, as hard as many of us have tried to have conversations with the Taliban or with those who have a lot of engagement with the Taliban about that question, I'd say it's an unknown, and it's been one of the most challenging unknowns at the heart of the process for the last many years, but particularly for the last 2 years, as to whether the Taliban are capable of the type of compromise that may be necessary to reach an agreement about an Islamic character of the state that is also sufficiently inclusive of the other sorts of principles and views that have animated the creation of the Republic, not only in the last 20 years, but in the last 100 years of Afghan's political evolution. And the problem is that based on past practice, it's hard to see. And we don't want to limit our conception of what the Taliban may do or are willing to do based on the 1996 to 2001 period. But at the same time, there have not been clear and convincing actions or signals that indicate that the capacity for compromise or the interest in compromise is great enough to accommodate that. So I think it is very much of an open question. I think that theoretically it's possible. Theoretically, there are many countries that have bridged this gap, that have bridged the gap between Islam of a certain character and the type of rights and citizen participation and sovereignty and accountability that are possible. But we have yet to see, in my opinion, whether the Taliban are sufficiently capable of embracing that. And by capable, I mean both whether ideologically it's something that they're willing to do, but also practically, politically, whether the movement can survive if some of those things that need to be compromised on in order to have a sustainable, democratic, rights-respecting state are things that would allow the Taliban movement to survive, or whether there would be too much conflict internally and infighting for them to make those sorts of agreements.
Thank you so much. Meredith, would you like to come in on this?
Sure. Thanks, Sultan, for sort of the most probably problematic question of the conflict overall. And I think just maybe to add on a couple of points to what Alex has said, I think what we see in other countries, and Alex sort of referred to some places where some of this has moved on, is that it's a slow evolutionary process, and it also requires dialogue and engagement. And I think, Sultan, to your point about the challenge of direct engagement at the moment between the leadership on both sides, I think there's several approaches that could be taken, and one would be identifying spaces where it is possible to have engagement from conservative elements within areas under the Taliban control with other groups to talk almost as a track to space to see what might be possible. And that's not necessarily asking people to move their space at the negotiating table at this time, but again, in that sort of space of consultation to possibly offer some new ideas. But I would also say that this is something that will happen over time. This isn't, you'll have an agreement that identifies some compromises by September the 11th, and then you'll see a new space. I think it would require a lot of these discussions to happen over a great deal of time. I would also say, however, that I think that there is maybe more space for reconsideration of what the ideological discussions are one piece, but from a practical perspective as well, I think in so many other processes, what we've seen is that there is often a need for internal dialogue on one side to address the diversity of its own constituency, and that there would be differing views within that more broadly. And often we don't spend enough time recognizing that and finding ways to harness that to potentially offer new solutions at the table. So I think that would be another element to look at.
Thank you very much. Barney, would you like to come in on the same point?
Yes, please. I think that to really understand what this issue is about, we shouldn't approach it as an ideological issue. We should approach it, as Dr. Fatani said, as an issue of power. Because this is not an academic debate. The issue is who has the authority and power to determine and enforce what is Islamic. That is the issue. The Taliban are drawn from and represent a particular stratum of the Afghan ulama. Nobody in the Taliban has attended the state madrasas and the Sharia faculty of Kabul University. They're all drawn from the rural private madrasas and the Deobandi madrasas in Pakistan. And this is a group that All governments of Afghanistan, except the Taliban government, have worked very hard to marginalize and remove from their positions of local power. And now they have made a comeback under the particular circumstances and are demanding power. So their idea of Islamic sovereignty is not just, everyone agrees that the state should be Islamic and Sharia should be. The point is, the structures that they advocate and put together empowered that group to determine what was Islamic. It invests Islamic scholars and Islamic scholars of a particular type with that power. The ulama who graduated from Kabul University and various parts of the state madrasas, they're well integrated into the state actually, even today. And they're the ones who are giving fatwas against the Taliban and so on. So it's fundamentally a question of political power and how the corporate interests of this very influential group, which became more powerful when the other groups were very badly damaged or destroyed in the war that took place since 1978, how they will be accommodated and incorporated into the state, which is a political issue, not a religious issue.
Thank you very much. It links actually your response to another question that has come from an anonymous attendee. Is asking, or she's asking, do you think that the Taliban representatives in Doha and their political leadership is politically savvy sufficiently to understand the complicated and utilize some of these comprehensive ideas that's been shared today? So it goes back to whether they have the capacity to do that kind of analysis to reach those conclusions. I don't know if any of you would like to comment on that from your contact. I see Barney's put up his hand. Yes, Barney, go ahead.
Well, there's a statement by a well-known American author that it's very difficult to get someone to understand something if his salary depends on his not understanding it. And I think the point is that these negotiations are a political process and a struggle over power. And what people are trying to understand is how to achieve their objectives. No, in fact, all the discussion, I've been part of many discussions about how to structure peace processes. I've been part of peace processes, trying to start them, trying to structure them, discuss how they should be conducted. The fact is, nobody structures peace processes. There is no one structuring peace process. There's no one determining, there's no we who determines what goes into them. They're part of a political process, and those who have the power to make the war are also the ones who determine what gets discussed and what are the conditions under which they stop making war. Once there is peace, perhaps you can open up the dialogue some more, but to some extent, as your starting point for a peace process has to be where the participants are now. You can't say, first you have to change your mentality and learn a lot of stuff, and then you can have a peace process. You just have to, you just, as an outsider, if you're going to be a mediator or persuade, you just have to accept they are who they are. They know and want what they want, and let's see how we can engage with them. If in the course of that process some of the ideas become relevant, then you can introduce them, and if they become relevant, you may not even have to introduce them because they'll see that they're relevant and they will use them. It's when they don't see that they're relevant that they show up, that they appear not to understand them.
Thank you so much, Moni. Professor Zaland, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. There's a question, there's a follow-up question to the discussion. Could be addressed to you. Do you feel that the Taliban have a genuine will to reach a negotiated settlement, or is the engagement in the discussions and the dialogue that is ongoing at the moment? And given what you described earlier in your presentation in terms of progress on the ground and engaging in continuous fighting and so on, is this engagement just a facade? There is no serious need to negotiate. They only need to wait until the Americans have left.
Thank you. I think that's one of the most important question. everybody else is raising this question whenever they are meeting or having meetings with Taliban in Doha. I see there will be participants in the panel that who will be directly representing the Doha Taliban office, or maybe some who are closely collaborating with them. But as an answer from my perspective, the Taliban's main party that they were really not planning to have a smooth and slow peace agreement was US and NATO. When they agreed with them on the purpose and condition of withdrawal, I think a peace agreement with Afghan parties will be an easy and winning chip for Taliban. They will be hurtfully willing to have a peace with all Afghan sides. That's what Taliban are usually claiming, that they are not monopolizing power. They are not eliminating anyone from the Afghan side once they are getting back to Kabul. Secondly, they have been also stating in their consecutive press releases that they are in Doha waiting for meaningful peace talks with Afghan sides. They have been engaged with the Republicans since September last year. They have agreed on procedures. They have been discussing agenda for peace process. So, but what I see, Taliban cannot wait longer. They cannot wait for years, as they waited for US and NATO for 20 years to get an agreement. They will not wait decades, or they will not wait for years to the Republicans to get agree on a peace process. So what is current going on, I think this is very much important to be a meaningful peace talks, not only from Taliban side, from the Republican side also, to have a solution which can be better off for everybody else. War, destruction, fight, it will not be better off for Taliban, neither for any other parties. It will destruct the country. It will make the population, Afghan population, disheartened and disengaged from anyone who is going to take over the Kabul. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If we still have 6 minutes, and we'll move on to some of the questions about the regional dynamics. There is a question here from Raffaello Pantucci about whether the role China and Russia are playing at the moment in Afghanistan. Has that role shifted, changed? Is it constructive sufficiently to see an end to the conflict in Afghanistan? Now, of course, those of you who have seen the program, we have a dedicated session to look at some of the regional issues tomorrow. But Barney, if you'd like to just briefly address the Russia-China from your perspective.
Yes, well, thank you. Of course, hi, Rafael. Thank you for the question. The process has been accompanied by a regional process, which was the assembly of what's called the Troika of the US, Russia, and China. It could be called the P3 from the Security Council. And then the expanded Troika, which includes those three plus Pakistan, and there was an open invitation to Iran to join that as well. Now, what we've seen since the announcement by President Biden of the US withdrawal is somewhat different responses from Russia and China. Russia very much welcomed the US getting out. That's been, it's wanted the US to get out for quite some time. And Russia has reactivated its diplomacy. You may recall that before, I'm sure you do, Rafael, that before the Doha talks started, there was a Moscow process. And the Moscow process has been suspended, but it is not ended. And recently, the Russians invited the various Afghan parties to Moscow, and they are prepared to reactivate it if there's a problem in Doha as well. Now, the Chinese have been a bit more critical of the American decision. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi called it a unilateral decision, meaning, I guess, that the Chinese were not consulted about the American decision. I happen to know that the Chinese were reaching out during the policy discussion in Washington trying to get some entry into it and were unable to obtain it. China's approach is not so much engaging the Afghan parties, though it has offered China as a venue for talks, but they have had the fourth meeting of the ministerial trilateral of China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and Wang Yi very much emphasized that that was the forum in which they would they think is vital for the future of peace in Afghanistan. Now, I think what we see in common between the two powers is they both appear to be adjusting to what will be a decline in the American influence and the American involvement, and are preparing to take a more active role. However, Russia appears much more confident, at least in the person of Zamir Kabulov, their special representative, to actually lead a peace process, while China would still prefer to, I think, remain in a supporting role, but feels that they're being forced to take a more active role by the United States. What form their collaboration or actions might take is uncertain, but I think they would both welcome the ability to cooperate with the United States. But the question is whether U.S. policy in other areas will be such that they will feel able to do that.
Thank you very much. We have another question related to the role of Turkey. I earlier said that we will be discussing the regional issues tomorrow, and of course I was mistaken. We will be discussing that in about 10 minutes in our second panel, which will be facilitated by Barney Rubin. So with the permission of the person who's asked the question, Asim Mary, I would like to maybe, Barney, if you can note that question for you later on about the role of Turkey. And I would add to that maybe the sudden appearance of Turkey on the scene in terms of the conference in Istanbul and so on, that was referred to earlier by Dr. Qahtani as one of the potential distractions that have led to a delay in the process. We'll come back to that in the next session. And a final question, and I'll put this to all the panelists. It's a kind of a feeling question. Do you feel that Qatar is impartial in this process? Most of you have had some form of contact. I would be particularly interested, Dr. Zaland, if you're still with us. And the question says, is Qatar the right impartial party to facilitate these talks? Zaland?
Yes.
The role Qatar is playing, is that impartial enough or impartial or?
I think it is, again, one of the very important questions. Qatar was selected at the beginning as a host for not only peace process for opening Taliban's office there. There were purposes behind. The main purpose, one was that Qatar is not a direct neighbor to Afghanistan. It is not closed in the region to Afghan war, which happened in the past 40 years, especially with U.S. invasion and after the Soviet invasion, and after the Soviet invasion to the civil war, Qatar was not party in support of anyone. Second, Qatar in the past 20 years after the U.S. invasion, Qatar was a non-aligned party to the war of Afghanistan. They were not directly supporting materially or even non-militarily the Afghan government or any other partner. So Taliban preferred to stay there and open an office. Third, Qatar is not having a regional, like we call it, pan-Qatari ambition in Afghanistan region. They are a non-political country to the region where Afghans can have
a good stage of, or a good format of intra-peace building process. And the last point regarding that is the Qatar experience and their own in the wars, especially to the central, to the Middle East conflicts, their involvement with many other groups which were involved in Middle East conflicts, and their hardship in shaping and facilitating peace building policies, strategies, and efforts in the region. So those were the main causes that somehow Taliban preferred to stay there and have an office there with the support of international community. Again, was by the Afghan government, one of those countries which can be seen as not only directly involved in the conflict, but an expert mediator for the role which Qatar played between Taliban and this. So just to on their experience, that was a chance for hosting the intra-Afghan dialogue or negotiation with the support of 4 other countries, Indonesia, Norway, Pakistan.
I think we may have lost Mr. Zaland link, but I think we'll bring it to a conclusion now. Thank you very much for our panelists. Thank you for the audience, those who are following us on the social media, and those who participated in this session. We are now going to take a 10 minutes break, and then we come back to our second session, which will be chaired by my friend Barney Rubin, and it will focus on the regional aspects of the discussion. I would like also to express a particular gratitude to the Factum Foundation, Art Foundation. If you notice the beautiful tapestry behind me, I am now in Madrid, and they've offered me their offices to broadcast from. So thank you very much to all involved, and we'll see you later in the second panel. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.